I'd like to thank the elders for asking me to come again to be on this lectureship. I appreciate that very much. I also want to thank Brother Paul and Sister Phyllis for their great hospitality. It's been interesting. I've learned to have some good Lebanese food that Phyllis fixed the other night, and they've learned to eat some good English food that Paul is very much enjoying. The good bread and the idea of cucumber sandwiches has been brought forth. A lot of people thought that I was sleeping at the back of the auditorium earlier. I wasn't. I was resting my eye, trying to get just a little bit of rest, but just to let people know that I heard everything that was said. I'm wondering whether it's really Karen in here or some imposter that she has paid to come and be here in the church services rather than be here herself. So whoever was telling that story, I heard it. Seriously, though, it's good to be here and to have this opportunity again. What we're looking at here is the period of conquest that deals with the book of Joshua. Joshua continues the work that was begun by Moses in the sacred history. And the book itself plays a significant part in salvation history. And it shows to us that God will perform whatsoever he promises his people. Joshua 21:45. In our study, we're going to note a number of highlights and at least one lowlight during this period of time that are recorded in the book. As for the date of the book, we have some information that helps us draw a conclusion, which is given in the manuscript. Beginning of the period of conquest being placed about 1451 BC, ending about 4443. The book itself, of course, was written for the learning of the children of Israel. And additionally, as part of the Old Covenant, it is part of that which is the schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, Galatians 3:24. Why was it written? Well, it's a sequel to the first 5 books of the Bible, showing the fulfillment of the promises God had made to Moses, and shows that God accomplished that which he had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Several references to the book of Joshua are found in the New Testament, as we see reference to faithful Rahab, the fall of Jericho, the example of victory by faith, the penalty for sin referenced in Acts 7:42, and the assurance of God's help that's referenced in Hebrews 13 and 5. Of course, the dominant character in the book of Joshua is Joshua himself, who had earlier been recognized as a military leader, Exodus 17:8 through 16. He was closely associated with Moses in the Exodus, as we see from a number of passages in that book. And he and Caleb were the only adults of the tribes that came out of Egypt to enter Canaan, having earned that privilege because they were totally faithful to the Lord when they reported back concerning the taking of the land. Joshua was appointed by God to succeed Moses, to lead the conquest into Canaan. He was an Ephraimite, Numbers 13:8. In Canaan, he settled in Timnath-Serah in 1950 of Joshua. And when he died, he was buried in the hill country of Ephraim, chapter 24, verse 30. Let's now kind of take an overview of the book. We're going to not be able to look at a lot of the things that are found in there, but we'll deal with some important highlights. First of all, following the death of Moses, there was a period of 30 days of mourning, Deuteronomy 34, verse 8. And then Joshua is charged with taking the people to cross the Jordan River. He accepted the charge. The land had been promised to the people, and like heaven, is worth all the necessary effort to obtain it, Hebrews 4:1. The boundaries of the land had been promised, and they are detailed. God's assurances were given for a successful conquest of the land, but victory was conditional upon their faithfulness and their obedience to God. Joshua and the people are assured by God that they would not have enemies that would have greater strength than them. But the conditional nature of God's rewards is taught throughout Scripture. God's law must be obeyed completely for those who desire to receive his blessings. And 4 times in the book, this first chapter of Joshua, he is commanded to be strong and of good courage. Now, courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of faith. They deserve to do all according to the law. As the leader of the people, Joshua knew that he was not to turn from the commandments of God, either to the right hand or to the left. Thus he would prosper if he did so, stayed firm to the Lord wherever he went. The book of the law was not to depart from his mouth, and he was to meditate on it day and night, Psalms 1 and 2. The command is given to prepare food, since it was uncertain when they might have more, as in 3 days they would cross the Jordan River. The tribes of Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh that had taken possession of the land on the east side of Jordan promised to keep the vows that they had made. Now the stage is set for conquest. Chapter 2, we see where the spies are sent out secretly to check out what was going on concerning the city of Jericho. We read where they lodged in the house of Rahab the harlot, but their presence became known to the king, and he sought for Rahab to hand them over. But she had hidden them, and she told the king's men that they had already left before the city gates had closed, and suggested they go quickly so that they might overtake the men. But actually she had hidden the spies on the roof. And she then arranged for the spies to escape after pleading for herself and her family to be spared. She asked for a true token as a guarantee, and the spies put up their own lives. However, that guarantee was conditional. First of all, she was not to utter a word about the spies' business. Second, a cord or rope was to be placed out of the window of her house, located on the city wall, and they were let down outside the city. And she was told that that scarlet thread that was used to let the spies down out of the window had to be there, and the family had to be in the house if they were to be spared. And after 3 days, the spies then returned to the camp, reported that the Lord had given them the land, and the children of the land were faint because of the Israelites, as if all the fight had gone out of them. In chapters 3 and 4, we read concerning the children of Israel crossing the Jordan River. The day that the Israelites moved forward, they arose early and moved towards the banks of the Jordan River. They didn't cross immediately. Preparations had to be made because they were moving into enemy territory. Specific instructions were given that they wait for the signal to move. That signal being the Ark of the Covenant that was being borne by the priests. They would follow it, keeping their allotted distance so that they could find their way, as they had not passed that way before. God was going to make them a way across the river. Joshua commands the people that they sanctify, they set themselves apart, as God was going to do wonders with the people and among them. The miraculous crossing of Jordan would magnify Joshua, confirm his leadership as the leader of the people of God, demonstrating that God was going to be with him as he had been with Moses. It also demonstrated and gave assurance that God would drive out their enemies from before them and would be with them. And so the Ark of the Covenant was to pass over before the people into the river. And as soon as the soles of the priest's feet reached the water's edge, God would perform the miracle. This time of year, Jordan was wide, a fast-flowing body of water. The waters were stopped by God from flowing downstream, and they would stand up in one heap, chapter 3 and verse 13. Only a miracle could explain what had happened. The priest holding the ark stood in the midst of the river, on the bed of the river, as the Israelites passed over. And the waters stayed back until all were safely across. Once they were over, God gave command to Joshua that 12 previously chosen men would take a stone out of the midst of the riverbed, carry it to the bank, and leave them there, each stone representing a tribe. And a mound was built with the stones to be a remembrance of what God had done, to remind future generations, and that all peoples would know God's mighty hand, and that they should fear him. It was the 10th day of the first month when they crossed the Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the east side of Jericho. In chapter 5, we read concerning Israel being circumcised and keeping the Passover. We note that Joshua is commanded to circumcise the Israelites the second time. The males who had come out of Egypt had all been circumcised, but during the 40 years in the wilderness, circumcision had not taken place. Now they were returned to the promised land. It must be done. And by this act, God said that he had rolled away the reproach of Egypt, chapter 5 and verse 9, from them. They then observed the Passover. The next day they ate of the old crop of the land, and the next day the manna God had provided for them in the wilderness ceased. It was no longer needed. They would eat of the fruit of the land. At this time Joshua receives encouragement when a man with a drawn sword appeared to him. And he asked him whether he was for Israel or their enemies. He was the captain of the Lord's host, chapter 5, verse 15. Joshua fell on his face to the earth and asked, "What saith my Lord unto his servant?" As with Moses and the burning bush, Exodus 3, 4, and 5, Joshua was commanded to remove his shoes because the place was holy. We must conclude that Joshua was in the very presence of God himself. In chapter 6, we come to the fall of Jericho, the beginning of the conquest. The gates of the city had been closed. None would be allowed out or in. Jericho was to be the gift from God to the Israelites. This would remove fear and give them courage to respond precisely to the instructions they received. However, the walls of Jericho needed to be taken down. God will remove the last obstacle separating the children of Israel from victory. The Israelites could not possibly entertain fear or failure. Jericho was God's gift, but when did Israel receive it? The Bible resoundingly tells us that the walls fell by faith. Hebrews 11:30. God's plan. Israel was to march around Jericho once a day for 6 days, and on the seventh day 7 times. Until the seventh day, on the seventh time on the seventh day, the people were silent. When the priests blew their ram's horns on the seventh day, the people shouted with a great shout. Then the walls collapsed. The city was taken. The walls fell down flat, and the people went straight into the city and took it. Jericho, along with his inhabitants, was to be accursed or devoted, set aside for the Lord. Only Rahab and her family that were gathered with her were to remain alive. The Israelites were clearly warned to keep themselves from that which the Lord had set aside for himself. If they disobeyed, they would be accursed. And any who took anything would make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. The spoils of war were consecrated to the Lord to be placed in his treasury. All living things in the city were destroyed because their sins would have contaminated God's people. Following the battle of Jericho, Joshua's fame spread as it became known that Jericho had fallen. But then we turn to chapters 7 and 8, where we find a lowlight in this situation. Following the battle of Jericho, Joshua sent men to go up and view the country, chapter 7 and verse 2, in and around the city of Ai. They reported back that the people were few, and only about 3,000 men would be needed to take the city, chapter 7 and verse 4. But they went forth, and they were put to flight. They were defeated, 36 being killed in the retreat. Israel suffered its only defeat at the city of Ai. As a result, chapter 7, verse 5, the hearts of the people melted. Why the defeat? The covenant had been violated. God was not with the people because there was sin in the camp. Joshua and the elders considered the defeat a sign of divine rebuke. They'd set out without consulting God. And while there was sin in the camp, Joshua poses a number of questions. God tells him to get up. It was time for action, not for complaining. He needed to find out what had caused the defeat, where the sin was, and remove it. The text describes how Achan was shown to be the sinner. They found the spoils in his tent. His family and his possessions were brought to the valley of Achor, the valley of Chumbley, where they were stoned and burnt. Now the people were again right with God, ready to go forth in faith and without fear. And so God instructs Joshua, telling him that he had given them the city of Ai, the land and the people. Yet he said to take all the people of war into the battle. And unlike Jericho, they were going to be allowed to take the spoil and the cattle for themselves. The instructions that God gave involved an ambush. Some men went by night behind the city and hid. The rest came at the city as before. The citizens came out of the city after the Israelites, and they fled, as had happened last time. The citizens pursued after them. But when they turned, they saw their city was burning, as the ambush from behind had come into the city and burned it. And then Israel turned back, and the men of Ai were trapped between the two parts of the Israelite army. The king of Ai was killed with the sword, and his body hung until the close of day. And then another heap of stones was made at this time as a reminder of the victory of faithfulness. Following this, the waging of war and conquest comes to a complete halt. Joshua now builds an altar of stone on Mount Ebal, according to the instructions of Moses, Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 2 and 5, and wrote on the stones a copy of the law in the presence of Israel. The tribes of Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin on Mount Gerizim, the Mount of Blessing. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali on Mount Ebal, the Mount of Cursing. And the blessings and the cursings were read, and the people agreed to its conditions. Chapter 9 deals with the deceit of the Gibeonites. You know, the people of the area had seen the successes of Israel, and some were ready to make terms with Israel. The Gibeonites determined they were going to save themselves. Now, according to the law, Deuteronomy 20, 10 through 18, the Israelites might make peace with distant cities, but those nearby were to be conquered and occupied. The craft and deceit of the Gibeonites is seen in that they claimed they were from far away. The men came wearing old tattered clothing with old provisions, giving the appearance they'd traveled a long way. Joshua inquired concerning their intentions, the kind of treaty they desired, their ethnicity, and where they were from. Their response, pure, unadulterated deceit, lies. Joshua and Israel were unwise in failing to consult the Lord, and they made a treaty with them. 3 days later, they found out that the Gibeonites were from just down the road. They were neighbors. But although they had been deceived, they considered the treaty as being binding. But justice, however, would be served. as they were made to be hewers of wood and drawers of water, chapter 9, verse 21. When questioned about their deceit, the Gibeonites said that they feared the God of Israel, whose army was conquering the land, and they were willingly accepted their sentence of service working amongst the Israelites. Chapter 10 of Joshua deals with the subjugation of southern Canaan. Because of the deceit of the Gibeonites, there was a conspiracy brought against them. The confederation of 5 kings wanted to make an example of the Gibeonites, and if they were unpunished, it would set a precedent. The Gibeonites sent to Joshua, entreating him to help repel this confederacy. Israel quickly responding, marching all night toward Gibeon. They pursued the enemy through the pass controlled by Beth-horon. The Lord intervened, caused a great hailstorm that accounted for more casualties than from hand-to-hand combat. Another miracle being wrought by the Lord as a result of Joshua's petition, in which the sun stood still and the moon stayed, chapter 10, verse 13, commonly referred to as the long day of Joshua. The Israelites won a decisive victory, but the 5 kings were still on the loose. They'd set up camp in a cave at Makkedah. The mouth of the cave was sealed. Guards were posted. Israel is ordered to advance and slay the retreating enemy. Then they returned to the cave. The mouth of the cave is opened. The 5 kings brought out. The captains were instructed to put their feet on the kings' necks, symbolizing their complete subjection. They were then slain. Their bodies hung on a tree until evening and then buried in the cave. The next assault came upon the well-fortified city of Lachish, and on the second day the stronghold is overthrown. During the battle, Horam, king of Gezer, arrives with his army to help defend the city, but is defeated and killed. Joshua moves on with his army and is victorious at Eglon. They next moved east into the hill country, taking Hebron, and then to the southwest and taking Debir. The last 3 verses of the chapter, the conquest, is summarized. And although the strong city-states of Gezer and Jerusalem had not yet been conquered, they had been isolated by that military campaign. So the whole area in the south, from Gibeon to Kadesh Barnea and Gaza, was under the control of Israel, when Joshua led his battle-hardened army back to the main camp at Gilgal. In chapters 11 and 12, the northern part of Canaan is subdued, and a summary of the conquest is given. With southern Canaan conquered, it's not surprising the kings of northern Canaan were fearful. They band together to oppose Israel. Jabin, king of Hazor, is so distressed, he seeks help from other kings. These kings were probably kings of cities that lay close to Hazor. Jabin sent word to all the cities around about to join him. They numbered as the sand of the sea that is upon the seashore in multitude. Chapter 11 and verse 4. They had horses and chariots, very many. Chapter 11 and verse 4. This is significant, since the children of Israel had none of the machines of war. They just had the power of Almighty God. There was a singular purpose for this confederacy. They pitched together, chapter 11 and verse 5, in an effort to seek their goal. There was harmony among the kings because of their purpose to fight Israel. The waters of Merom, chapter 11, verse 5, were chosen as the place of assembly. The army was numerically the greatest that Israel had faced. But God promised to fight with Israel. And thus victory was a foregone conclusion. The account of the war between the Israelites and the Confederacy of Kings is short. Israel came against them suddenly. Chapter 11, verse 7, New King James Version. Not waiting for the enemy to attack. The action was swift, with the element of surprise having a profound effect. The enemy was routed. Joshua gave God the glory. Those who initially escaped, slaughter fled, some westward towards Sidon on the Mediterranean coast, while others fled eastward towards Mizpah. But they were pursued. Those who were captured were slain, according to the instructions of God. Hazor, the prominent city of the area, and its king fell to the sword. The other kings involved were also destroyed, as were their cities. Joshua burned Hazor with fire, chapter 11 and verse 11. But the other cities were spared. Just the people were destroyed. The Hivites, part of the confederacy, made peace with Israel and were spared. And the spoils of war belonged to the victors. Now we see where Joshua gives a summation of all that occurred during the conquest. All of the land from the south by the Dead Sea to Mount Hermon in the north was conquered. All of the kings were slain. Now we cannot infer from this that all the Canaanites were slain, because in later years they caused problems for Israel. But it took 7 years to accomplish the conquest, for God had hardened the hearts of the heathen cities so that they would not sue for peace. The Anakims were driven out and cut off from the mountains. Their cities were utterly destroyed, a number left in the land promised to Israel. Joshua succeeded because of his integrity in holding fast the commands God had given. Because of God's power in giving into Joshua's hand all that opposed the people of God. Chapter 12 gives the division of the land east of Jordan that was conquered under Moses, which was divided among the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. The remaining verses of the chapter list all of the kings conquered by the Israelites as they took Canaan in order to settle it. Each one is mentioned together with the cities over which they had reigned. In chapters 13 through 19, we find the allotment of the land by tribes. It's very important as it determines the boundaries of the inheritance of each of the tribes. It begins with God's directive to divide the land. Joshua's earthly sojourn was rapidly drawing to a close, and thus the division had to be done even before all of Canaan was literally in Israel's hands. God had given all the land to Canaan, but they had to possess it. The boundaries of the land for the 2.5 tribes are given first. Levi would receive no inheritance, no land as an inheritance. The remaining chapters in this section show the division of the land among the remaining tribes. The division was done by lot, but the size of the tribes was taken into consideration. At this time, Caleb comes forth requesting he receive the mountains of Hebron for his inheritance, reminding the people that Moses had promised him these lands because of his faithfulness. His request being granted, he takes possession of the land. Jerusalem, a part of the inheritance of Judah, was not taken because of a lack of faith and courage. This was true for the rest of the cities that remained in the hands of the enemies of the people of God. Ephraim was glad to let the Canaanites live in Giza, as long as they paid tribute to the tribe, this being easier, safer, and more profitable than utterly destroying them from the land. Nevertheless, God's will was not obeyed. These, along with other Canaanites, would continue to trouble the children of Israel from that point forward. After Ephraim and Manasseh received their inheritance, Joshua brought the whole nation together at Shiloh. The tabernacle was set up in the place where God had chosen. It remained there until the time of the judges. Following the setting up of the tabernacle, the remaining 7 tribes began to receive their inheritance by lot. At the conclusion of the division of the land among the tribes, they gave Joshua an inheritance in the middle of them. Timnath-Serah in the mountains of Ephraim was where Joshua lived until his death. Chapters 20 through 22, we see the cities of refuge being mentioned and the return home of the tribes across to the other side of Jordan. At his death, Moses had appointed 3 cities of refuge east of Jordan. Now Joshua is called upon to appoint more. The additional cities being Kadesh in Galilee and Mount Naphtali, Shechem in Mount Ephraim, and Kiriath Arba, Hebron, in the mountain of Judah. Next, the cities for the Levites were distributed according to the command of God. These cities would enable the Levites to provide for themselves, in addition to the tithes that they would receive from the other people. With the priests dispersed in their cities, they would be ready to serve Israel. 6 of the cities of refuge were 6 of the cities that were granted to the Levites. In Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 through 45, we see where God's promises that he had made were fulfilled. God had promised Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation and inherit Canaan and the extent of the land. Moses had told them to go in and to possess the land that God had promised them. And just before he died, Joshua told Israel, chapter 23, verse 14, "Not one thing hath failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spake concerning you. All are come to pass unto you, and not one thing hath failed thereof." These very statements here refute the doctrine of premillennialism concerning the promised land. Nothing had failed concerning God's promise. Why people cannot see when the word clearly states all had been fulfilled, I don't understand. Premillennialism seeks to change everything with regards to the church and the kingdom. This idea that Israel must be restored to the land in order that God might give them all that God had promised is false to the nth degree. They already had it. Now the war was over, the armies disbanded. Tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, having performed their vows and their agreement, returned to their possessions east of Jordan. When they crossed the river, there they built an altar. And when the rest of the tribes heard about this, they gathered at Shiloh, ready to go to war against them. But first of all, they sent Phinehas and the princes of Israel to see what had gone on. They made accusations against the 2.5 tribes, accusing them of rebellion that would bring God's wrath against them. And they urged them not to rebel. The 2.5 tribes responded in their own defense. The altar had not been built for religious purposes, but was there to be a witness that they were one with the remaining tribes on the west side of Jordan. That response was accepted. They returned to Shiloh and reported to the people, who were pleased and resolved not to go to battle against them. In chapters 23 and 4, we have the closing part of Joshua's life. He was now waxed old and stricken in age, chapter 23 and verse 1, had withdrawn to his inheritance to enjoy the last days of his life. However, when the time of his death drew near, he gathered the representatives of the people together to warn them concerning apostasy. There was much piety and modesty in this address, as he knew the glory for Israel's victories belonged to God. Joshua had made sure that all of the land had been divided by lot and was possessed by the Israelites, but made it clear God could not be taken for granted. And thus he encourages them to continue to be faithful, and that God would continue to be with them. He also warned them what would be the result of turning their backs upon the Lord. It closes with Joshua's final challenge to Israel. He warned and admonished them regarding their faithfulness to God. He rehearses all God had done for the children of Israel. Then Joshua sets 2 choices before the people, but made it clear where he and his family stood. The people declared that they would remain faithful. But Joshua presses his point that they could not serve God if they forsook him and started serving other gods. He stressed that God would not tolerate or sanction such behavior, but would fight against them as he had done against those pagans who had been in Canaan before the conquest. Joshua had done all that he could. He had said all that he knew to say. It was now up to the people to live up to that which they had committed themselves. And Joshua then dismissed them to their own inheritance. Choose ye this day whom you would serve. The final verses of the book deal with Joshua's death and burial. The important words in these verses are the fact that he was the servant of the Lord, chapter 24, verse 29. The place of Joshua's burial is insignificance, and his lineage doesn't matter. What was important is that he served the Lord God with all of his heart, mind, soul, and strength. We should be remembered for. We're told the burial of the bones of Joseph that had been brought out of Egypt, and the death of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, was recorded. And now with the death of the high priest, the days and times of Joshua come to a close. I just want to read these words from Adam Clarke concerning the conclusion of the book and the history of Israel. Thus nearly all the persons who had witnessed the miracles of God in the wilderness were gathered to their fathers, and their descendants left in possession of the great inheritance, with the law of God in their hands, and the bright example of their illustrious ancestors before their eyes. It must be added that they had possessed every advantage necessary to make them a great, a wise, and a holy people. How they used, or rather how they abused these advantages, their subsequent history, given in the sacred books, amply testifies. You know, we have the example here of the conquest of the land and the need for faithfulness to God. Throughout the scriptures, we are told that we are to be faithful even unto death. We must therefore stand fast. God will give us the victory in Christ if, that's a little word, but it's a huge word, if we remain faithful to him. This period of the book of Joshua, period of conquest, reminds us again of the need for faithfulness. Thank you.